Whenever I'll.
Well, welcome to our final installment of our God, Violence, and Power class tonight. Happy to, we'll do a little bit of a recap about what we've talked about, and then try and connect it a little bit more to our actual world and what is our response as people of faith in the world, in a world that we know is violent and is complicated, and especially having a faith that I think calls us to answer those questions and to try and have those conversations. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. Also happy, since this is the last week, to talk a little bit about other topics we might want to dig into in future courses, or other things that would be of interest as we sort of all live into this Theologian-in-Residence moment that I'm happy to be able to share with everyone here at Messiah and online. And we'll just see where we end up. So just to sort of do a quick 30-second Cliff Notes version of where we started out. That first week, we talked a lot about violence in the Christian tradition and how these types of things that maybe don't necessarily seem like they would be used in violent ways that we hear about theology practiced, or that we hear about the cross understood in the lives of our church, but have sometimes been used in ways that hurt individuals and hurt our communities, right? And so how do we talk about a faith that we proclaim Christ crucified for us without glorifying suffering, right? And had some of those tough conversations. And I think as Lutherans, right, we talk a lot about the both and. We're both sinners and saints all at the same time, and we hold a lot of these tough things, in contrast, and try and figure out what that looks like and how to deal with that. So we looked at some of those atonement theories, did some heavy theological lifting that first night, but y'all hung with it, so I appreciate that. Then we looked a little bit more at some specific biblical texts and how we interpret those. So we looked not only at some of that historical context about how, what was the culture like when these texts were written? What kinds of things were they trying to share with their audience or convince their audience of? And then also, right, how do we receive these texts in the here and now? How does our own lived experience or our location in the Upper Peninsula influence how we read these texts and how we understand God and the humans that are involved in all of these? How do we approach all of those pieces? Then last week, we connected it all back to our understandings of God and talked a little bit about what God looks like for us when we think of God as a picture in our mind. What does that mean? And then looked at a couple of other biblical texts to sort of decide what was God like in those texts, or what was God's relationship to humanity in those texts, and started to kind of see what we could learn about not only God, but humanity and ourselves through looking at some of those texts. So with all of the sort of Cliff Notes versions of where we've been, I think now in this final class, right, the question is, where do we go from here? So we know that we live in a violent world that is complicated. We know that our relationships with other humans are complicated. And then we add our systems of government and church hierarchies and all of these other pieces. And it is a pretty exciting mess, I think, to try and navigate all of those pieces and figure out where we go. So let's jump in a little bit. So we started to talk a little bit about sin last week, and these are sort of some of the base understandings of sin that a lot of folks would talk about in sort of a theological context or a historical context even. But what do you think of, or what comes to mind for you when you think of sin? No right or wrong answers. And it could even be an example, of something that you would see on the news and say, yep, that's what sin looks like. Or, maybe the Hollywood version of, our Catholic brothers and sisters in the confessional. What are they, what are they confessing? What are these these sins? What does sin mean for us?
I get to the things that destroy the creation that God has given us, so that then we are separated from God, from one another, and from the universe. In fact, so that all those kinds of things that we're now understanding, even to our dishwasher liquid, or the stuff that goes in the dishwasher, then has all those little plastic particles that end up in the ocean. It's like, wait a minute, I don't really want to wash dishes, but am I sinning because that is helping to destroy the universe? Where do I go? I don't know.
I think that's great. The apartment complex that I live in does not do recycling. And, I try to be the person who has the bin, and then I'll, take it to the center.
My house.
But thank you, deal, see, perfect. But right? And so, but every once in a while, right, it has sat for too long, and it's like, oh, do I really have to deal with that? But it's true. There's this, okay, there is a direct impact to this universe and this creation, and trying to be accountable. Yep, absolutely.
So I'll expand on it. I went appliance shopping today. Really interesting. I mean, I've got appliances that are 20 years old, and they may last for another 10 years. I don't know. There's some issues. Can you get the parts? Yeah. Are they expensive? Yeah. Almost half the cost of new appliances.
Right.
But I can get by without it. But as one of the stores told me, appliances now can last 6 to 8 years. Then you just toss them and get a new one. Parts are cheap. We're having problems with people actually. One guy kind of retired from fixing things up here, and so you don't have a lot of support like you used to have. Mm-hmm. But you're saying you really don't need it because you can just toss it away and get a new one. Mm-hmm. So that expands on the environmental issues. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah.
So my freezer in the fridge is starting to squawk at me again.
What is there? It's somebody is applying.
Dead seagull.
All right, exactly, yeah. And that makes a big difference, right? When we're having to constantly replace things, or we're comfortable with having to buy something new and just throw away whatever we're not using. Absolutely.
And it is diabolical because, you're supposed to be running on the conscientious, but how to make your progress. It's not necessarily right.
Right. It doesn't help us to do that.
It's a shelf life.
Yep. Yeah, really good points.
And often you can't get the replacement parts.
Right.
Right. So even if you want to hang on to something longer and have it fixed, it might cost you as much as something brand new to just get the part. And yep,
If you can get them.
right. Exactly. So definitely a pretty clear connection for us, right, between that environmental piece and all of those pieces and our interconnectedness, right? So I think one of the big places is, and really a really big shift in religion and theology, is when we started to sort of move away from this idea of sin as breaking divine law. So it's not that sin isn't that, but we've sort of broadened it to be much bigger and much more interconnected than that, right? So certainly, right, where if we think about divine law as the 10 Commandments, just as an example, it's not that we're saying that we shouldn't follow those or we should ignore those, but it's more than that, right? So it's, love your neighbor as yourself, and that also means, right, being intentional about the things that we throw away or how we recycle, because not only does it leave our planet and creation better for future generations, but potentially, right, it has a direct impact on other countries or the costs or, right, all of these things. We talk a lot about this global interconnectedness and all of these connections between various countries. And I think especially being, a fairly wealthy country in the developed world, we do have responsibilities, right, as Christians and people in that creation, to be aware of the ways that all of that sort of spirals out and is interconnected. Absolutely. Other thoughts on sin or understandings of how sin works or plays out in our world?
I was thinking about the Ukraine war, and the goes back to divine law that we shouldn't kill, and yet, you know, I want Ukraine to be free, and I don't want the people there to suffer. I was am reading a book from the library about the abuses that the indigenous people suffered in our country and Canada, and you know, we're kind of complicit. We didn't do that, but our government did it, and some of our churches.
Right? Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? There are all of these, I don't know, past sins, right? That maybe we didn't, you know, physically do it. We weren't the ones actually participating in this, and yet we are living and trying to navigate the world that was left behind after that, right? Yeah, absolutely. I had the privilege of working with, his name is Vance Black Fox, and he's a native Cherokee person, and being able to hear about his family's traditions and how they came to be Lutheran, right? And it's not necessarily a pretty history, right? So what is sort of this cost of being a colonial power and using that power, whether it's the church or government or whatever these structures are, to overpower and to oppress because we have decided we know what's best. Or we have your best interest in mind. And so obviously becoming Christian and letting go of your traditions and your personhood, even in a lot of cases, is what we've decided is best. And so, yeah, how do we really rebuild those relationships and those communities in a way that can be safe and life-giving and sure, maybe still honor that Christianity, but, you know, be able to have it be positive.
Simply to acknowledge that this was not an empty continent.
Yeah.
You know, that one, the book that we had, which is, what was it, 1643 or 1642, and that book that we read through, I think that we had from here, we went through all of these different contexts and things. Okay, we introduced organisms that had never been here before. It's very much like COVID, but COVID spread much faster. Or even the talk about the flu epidemic, and there is some tracing of that flu epidemic back to Kansas.
Really interesting.
From a farm in Kansas where it jumped in, the people then went to France, and a lot of people there because they were all together got it, and then it spread all over because people at the end of the war went home and took it with them.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that. So yeah,
maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but that it's it's a theory, just like was it from an animal jumping and who knows?
Right. Well, I think it's right. I think it's maybe really easy to see with sicknesses like a flu or a COVID, something like that. We can watch how quickly, especially now with global travel, right? How quickly things can move because of air travel and all of these pieces. But also, right, I think we underestimate sometimes how ideas and concepts and belief systems can move in those ways too. And especially, we've talked about this in other sessions, as much as folks use social media or even just, regular media, if you hear something on the news, even if you maybe don't fully register or believe it as you're listening to it, you might remember then when somebody else is talking about it and say, oh yeah, I did hear. Right. So it's easy to see sometimes how we're interconnected with those health pieces or with some of those. But I think also, right, the ideas. And we've talked a fair amount about that mob mentality and being able to sort of get a group of people to believe the same way, or at least act like they're believing the same way and do things in those moments. And I think that's, it's an interesting concept to try and see how that impacts the day to day.
Related to some of those, the war in Iraq, say that over 1 million Iraqis have died, and I think of John Pine's song where he says some cowboy in Texas starts a war in Iraq, and sometimes because we have so much power, it's easy to jump in and say we are going to fix this. Even if we don't know what we're doing,
Or it need fixing.
1 million people or more.
Mhm.
And the people there are
Still.
still in a mess.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's worse, but it's a mess, yeah. And in so many other places where we've intervened in other countries, that we have really made a mess out of that.
Actually, I heard in the Rockies, in an interview today,
Today, yes.
who was saying, we want that dictator back. Things were stable when he was here.
Sure.
We knew what was going to happen, yes, but because we don't now know what is happening or which factor is going to be in power, we're really stuck. He says, yes, we didn't want him to be here forever, but he kept things stable.
Right? So what's there's a quote about that, right? Like the enemy you know is like, kind of a thing, like at least you know what to expect and know, but I mean, kind of, right, what's coming. Yeah, absolutely.
But listen.
See, I was going to say, this is maybe not social media, but right, our media outlets, right? And so that we can have the same thing. Yep, absolutely. So I think one of the questions that a lot of these conversations about sin or violence or power, right? Because this is also this idea of power over, right? I've decided I know better, so let me come in and fix this for you, and then probably leave it a bigger mess than it was to begin with, right? So the questions that come up a lot in these discussions from an ethical and moral viewpoint are really, what do we as individuals owe to each other? And so a lot of these questions become, if we see, we're going to talk a little bit tonight too about gun violence, right? So we see mass shootings, I would say most days in the news, and probably they happen every day, but we just maybe don't see coverage on every single one, right? But when we see things like that in the world, what do we do as people of faith? How do we respond or live out our faith in a world where we are constantly seeing these very real violent problems with society? What do we do with that?
And I think it makes it difficult to understand and to talk about, because then it isn't just politics, but religion gets tied into it, and then it's not our understanding of what God wants for us, but it still is projecting an image of what Christianity is today. And not to go on another topic, but I think we're losing people because of that.
Yeah, that's true. And there's, I think, so many of our conversations, even sort of as we were building this class, and Pastor Andrew and I were sort of talking through and trying to figure out, what direction to go in, or because, right, I mean, this is such a huge topic. But it's hard because, right, so you talk about gun violence, and it's really hard to not also talk about racism or police violence or mental health diagnosis and concerns. And then that leads right into a conversation about healthcare in our country, right? So you kind of, right, it spirals really, really quickly, right? And you're like, oh, let's talk about gun violence. And now it's like, oh, now we're talking about, rights to bear arms. And now we're talking about what happens when someone, does have mental health diagnoses and isn't able to afford a medication that might help them manage that. Or, and why don't we talk about any of those things, right? So
Psychic numbing, and we say, well, we're not going to talk about any of them.
Yes.
Let's go and let's read it.
Exactly, right?
I have a bunch of books I haven't read yet.
Right? It's true though, yeah. Right? And it's all like
the sand,
right? And it's true, right? It is this like the psychic numbing and the survival instinct on some level, right? Because if we really sat with all of the heaviness of all of these problems, it's really hard to stay motivated and stay hopeful, right? I mean, how do you see all of this in the news and think about this? The Michigan State shooting. One of the survivors of that shooting was also a survivor of the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting. And I mean, first of all, to have been a survivor of 2 major shootings like that in your lifetime, but I couldn't believe how many years had passed already, where these children in an elementary school were now in a college setting. And I mean, just to have that conversation, and then, right, we'll see some news coverage on it, and maybe we're upset or passionate or, try to move for change for a little while. And then, it kicks in, and we can't deal with all of this despair and all of this violence. And so I think we get paralyzed a little bit and aren't really sure how to move forward from there.
And, as a retired teacher, I'm having to go through those drills with children. And, the emotional effect of that on children and staff, I don't think has been addressed. And we're seeing it again. Our grandchild and my friends' grandchildren, they come home and they're asking questions about it, It's hard.
I can't imagine.
But we also had the atomic drills.
Sure.
So
Not up here.
you should have up here because you had the Air Force base here. We didn't. Because we
I don't
did.
remember that.
Yes,
Hope for the
in
best.
hall, sitting down, basically, putting your hands over your head, supposedly that was somehow great.
That's what Ray is always laughing at, right? Because it's like, yes, that would have worked out great.
Yeah.
Right? That would have made such a difference that you were under your desk. Right?
Yeah.
Well,
But anyway.
we had the air raid shelters in all the schools, remember that? The little civil defense.
Different settings that you go down into, but
Well, in
You-
your
you think
schools.
we end up having that part of our childhood fortunately happen to be amnesiac.
I was going to say, I was going to try to help you, and I was like, I know I can't say it. Yep, exactly.
So that it
Yeah.
can be curious thing because it does happen. Certain parts you can.
I
Don't you
think-
remember when your aunt yelled at you? Oh, I know, she was always very.
Right, exactly.
I think that was, at least growing up in the copper country, that was far away for us, But when I think about the children in the schools and you're going through that 2 or 3 times a year and they're actually having to shelter and, you stay in place, the lights are off, shades are down, you have to wait until a school social worker or someone from the police department. Bill was often that person, social worker, and wait for them to tell you to clear the room. And especially, I worked with elementary, the younger ones especially. Yeah, it was very hard.
And I think, right, we need to start having those conversations because, we need to help. If we're going to run kids through those drills and talk about that, we need to also figure out how that's impacting them and how we talk about that and help them walk through that, because that's really, really difficult. I feel like I still remember we did, how they always have the firefighters come and do a presentation, and I remember having horrible nightmares and being so stressed out, right, for the week or 2 after those presentations always happen. Right, because they, and they do it in a fun way. And my stepdad is one of the people that would come into the schools and do that. So, it shouldn't have been this sort of terrifying thing. But I think, right, it's the way we teach, especially little ones. And then we have, these situations that we understand that, there's a reason why we're doing this or we're explaining this, and we think we're doing it in age-appropriate ways. But I think we overlook a lot how much that's impacting how they understand the world and how, they're still trying to figure out where they're safe and how they're safe in these settings. That's really.
So I think all the laws of the world, I had a conversation with someone a few days ago. And it's all this violence that has been separating him from God because he feels, how could God allow this to happen? And I can tell you, I just didn't know what to say at that point. But what would your response be to that?
It's a great question. A pastor friend and I were having this conversation, and I was like, "Oh, that's a huge theological question, and it depends on the branch of theology and whatever." And he goes, "Nope, it's really simple. Just answer the question." And I was like, "No, it's really not." But I think for me, what it comes down to, right, is that we have a loving God, and for better or worse, that loving God has, whether created us or whether we sort of earned it in the fall, has given us free will. And as soon as you have free will and you have choice, you have the possibility to choose wrong and to create, these horrible things. And granted, are there things that happen in human life that are not caused by another person's violence or another person's, whatever? Absolutely. But I think ultimately for me, what it comes down to is that if humans have free will, then there are things that we are allowed to choose and live out that God isn't going to minutely control. And I think that's uncomfortable.
Wasn't there's something about you have two choices, you have 50% chance of doing good and doing evil?
Right, yep.
And then, okay, so you do the good, but then you have two choices, you have the 50% chance of doing good and evil. But if you do nothing, it's definitely going to be the evil kind of thing. So it's better to, and I don't, who is that?
Is
that Luther?
You guys are just super on it. I love it. Huzzah. So we'll go back to that one. But the Cliff Notes version, right? So not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. Our favorite German Lutheran pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Cool.
Yes. He just looks so approachable in the picture, though, doesn't he? I'm just like, I want to be your friend.
The pastor who married him met him in New York when he was over in 1938, and they were asking him not to go back.
So he was here, and he was safe, and you felt that he did. I just got chills. That's fascinating that they got to meet him. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was ultimately hung by the Germans for he and a group of other scholars and theologians were imprisoned for planning an attempt to assassinate Hitler. And so we get a whole lot of ethical conversations about this, right? So the question becomes, because I would say most of us in this room, right, would agree that murder is probably bad as a general rule, right? Can I assume that? I mean, you know where I'm going with this, so you know the punchline. But in general, right, I think we can assume murder would be bad. We put that on the sin side. Most of us are not gonna, go do that on our way home from church tonight or anything like that. But if you're going to do something bad for the right reasons or for the greater good,
Sin boldly.
Yes, right, exactly, right? So it sort of becomes this concept of, okay, if I believe that it's wrong to murder people, but I know that what Hitler is doing is also wrong, and it would save countless lives, then is it okay? So we get into this, right, really complicated place where, and a lot of his letters and papers from prison, right, he's trying to work this out, and he's trying to figure out, are there degrees of how wrong something is? And if your motivation is good, or you're interested in that, connection of community, can you do the bad thing for a good reason and have that at least be morally and ethically neutral? Maybe not good, right? Because again, right, he's enough of an ethicist that he can't say, yep, killing Hitler is only good. But is it a good enough, given the bad, to make it neutral? Right? So that, it's pretty intense, right? And then it becomes, where's the line, right? So I think we used to joke in undergrad that if you give students enough time, it will always come back to Nazis. And it's kind of true. Somehow, most religion courses, if you give them enough discussion time, no matter where you started, somehow you end up back on Hitler or Nazis. And I think it's because the way that we understand that is so clear cut, right? It's pretty hard to see a gray area. It's pretty hard to argue, that there's two sides of that story or all of those pieces. So it becomes a really helpful, if dark, example, just because it's, nobody is, well, I'm sure there are Holocaust deniers, but in general, no one is arguing that this was acceptable or historically.
But they aren't saying that it wasn't evil. The story is not evil. What they're saying is, hey, it never happened.
Right.
Which is
exactly.
different than saying.
Than just saying it was fine. Yeah.
They're not.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But there are the
Well,
neo-Nazis.
there actually are the ones that are saying it's fine.
Yeah.
They're not denying that they're saying it's fine. I've been doing a lot of reading about some of the right-wing militias and that sort of, and they're not denying any of the Holocaust or anything. They're just saying that was the right thing to do.
Yikes.
That's,
Which leads us back to how do we deal with that in the world,
Yeah.
right? Like,
how do you deal with that?
Well, you're starting by recognizing it and telling us, okay, so yes, there are those people who deny it totally, but there is this other branch that we could look at if we wanted to look at it more seriously, and then from there figure out what we're going to speak up
Right.
about.
Right. Exactly. I think too, right, the sort of this idea of is doing something that is wrong for a morally good way or for a morally good reason or a greater good kind of reason. If we're okay with that, where is the line, right? Because
Who
then
determines what's the better
Right.
good?
exactly, right? So there is sort of this, and I think with on some level something as drastic as an assassination plot of like something like that, right? On some level we're like, okay, that one feels clearer. And again, I'm assuming a lot about your opinions of things, right, in this room. But right, like in general, it might seem fairly clear to us, right, that okay, by acting and by trying to make a plan to actually do something and put an end to this Hitler person, right? If he's actually taking an action and intentionally doing this, at least we're doing something, right? At least we're trying to do something. And so then how do we sort of bring that down to those small little things like gun violence or like our connection to the community or all of those pieces, right? So how do we be a little less big picture, right, than assassinating world dictators and all of those pieces, but how do we bring that down to our level? What are the ways that we can speak and act in our churches and our communities in ways that would actually impact real change?
Well, I'm thinking of like Bread for the World group, which started out as a Lutheran pastor and now then had to be separated because it got too political for a lot of the Lutheran churches. So now it's a separate entity.
Sure.
But it works and really has done a lot for getting food to people who need it. And it's a continued thing. And yet this congregation doesn't do a whole lot of the letter writing.
Sure. I think sometimes too it's almost like overwhelming, right? So we have maybe there's like a specific organization we work with during the holidays, and there's what's the Food for America that comes a few times a year? Feeding America. There we go.
Once a month.
Once a month. Okay, yeah. So, right. So sometimes, right, there's almost like this feeling of overwhelm because there are so many organizations and so many ways that we want to step up that we get caught in this like, oh, what do I pick or which one is valid, right? Because we hear the horror stories of, oh, this, particular organization isn't actually helping the people they claim to be helping.
Like Feeding America, we have visual proof of their helping people here.
Yeah.
Bread for the World is more ethereal because it's working on a political basis, so people can accept the one more easily lots of times than they can the other.
That's true. Yep. And then you get the argument, let's take care of our own.
Right? Yep, exactly.
Taking care of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then usually you want to ask those people, and exactly what are you doing to take care of your own?
Right,
Because most of
exactly.
them aren't doing anything
Yeah.
to take care of anybody other than themselves.
Right.
I recycle out one.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly, right? So it is sort of this, yeah. And all those pieces. And I think too, right? It's hard because even when folks really are doing things, right, there's a lot of pieces to consider, right? Every time you're somewhere where there's not recycling, and you have that, plastic whatever, it's like, oh, I really have to like put this in my bag and take it home with me and put it in my box, or even just, I had a friend who went on a rant about having to clean out the yogurt container. And she's like, I know it's not a big deal, but I know I need to clean it out and it's a problem. But right, so yeah, all of those little pieces. But finding, I think, right ways to be able to connect, whether it is in your community or on a global scale, and finding ways to commit to that, right, is a great way for us to not only connect, hopefully, in our communities and with these organizations, but also, right, to make a little bit of an impact for the larger world.
Oh, there's we lived in Ohio, community gardens, which are really more popular here too. I didn't have a lot of poor and hungry down there, but what they did in some areas is they had community gardens for the poor to teach them how to garden. Either it was at the park or at the vacant lot or that sort of thing. So it gave them, I think, a sense of commitment to their lives and responsibility.
There's a lot of urban farming in Detroit area now.
Sure. Yep. I love that though, right? So it's sort of the doing, but also, right, the educating and helping to lay that groundwork so that it can continue. And
Fish,
yep.
Teaching
Yep.
fish on fish, yeah.
Yep. I love that.
It kind of circles back to politics too, because if we had equal taxation, I don't think that there would be the starvation, in our country. And I think we have enough to take care of the rest of the world. And then we're just one country. If every country that had the means to contribute.
There is enough food in the world to feed everybody.
Well, yeah, that's true.
How much we throw away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. All of that. Yep. And right, I think that trying to figure out, right, what that looks like when we know there are folks going to bed hungry in our community, and figuring out how to sort of like make that leap, right? How do we do that? Growing up, my family of four was not well off. I think most of you were in church the Sunday I preached, but I talked a little bit about frying bologna. And ate a lot of bologna, ate a lot of Spam. I can remember, my family of four having leftovers from the blue box of Kraft mac and cheese, which now, as an adult and college student who would eat an entire box of by myself, in the middle of the night at the dorm, it's mind blowing to think about what my family of origin was able to survive on, and certainly thanks to grandparents and church members. And right, I mean, there was certainly a lot of behind the scenes things that I wasn't aware of as a kiddo. But to think about that versus the privileges and the things that I got to go to a private school for college. I have lots of student loans to show for it, but I was able to go to seminary, right, and worked and did all of those things, and now I'm finally right in a place where I'm able to give back to other organizations and able to be intentional about not just surviving, right, and not just like sort of meeting the base need level, but being able to be in a place where my survival can happen and I can also help others to survive, right? And so finding that those little ways to be able to acknowledge what we have, and then acknowledge that maybe what we have is more than enough, and then maybe we can share that, right? So that's the bigger table idea.
So what steps? Okay, we had talked about silence, not being silent in the face of evil. And then we talked a bit about political things. You go every morning? She has a breakfast at the shelter.
At the Army.
Yeah. Kids are really early.
I've
I'm
done.
concerned because I'm not up until she's coming home. But that kind of thing, and that's not something that I do. I mean, I sew the quilts and I do other things and take communion around.
That's your skill.
And
Exactly.
that's something that,
Everybody has their own. Yep, exactly.
but it's sort of like, okay, what kinds of things would you think to move beyond this, not just the silence in the face of evil, but supporting the universe
Yeah.
and our relationship to God? What kinds of things would be our steps we could take? That's where I'd like to go.
Ideal. I think we were laughing a little bit before because I was like, I do not have answers for any of these giant questions, but yeah, I think
little steps.
right, little steps. It's true. I think for me, right, the piece. I think there's always two pieces. So I think the first thing is asking ourselves where the need is, or where care or ministry could be put in. So I think I mentioned Vance, who I used to work with, but I worked with him on a youth in mission organization. And so it was a lot about mission trips and going in and doing things for communities to help them. But it was early on in the process that we realized no one was actually asking the community what they needed or what they wanted, right? So it's like, hey, we're gonna come in and paint this for you. Well, I mean, great, but also we have, I think one year it was this playground equipment for our daycare kids that no one has the skills to put together. So it was like, as soon as you start asking, I think, what a community needs and identifying what that need actually is, that's sort of, for me at least, right, that first piece, right? So being able to figure out what we need, and then how do we do it, right? So once we know what we need or what a community is asking for, or where that need is, or where we can put that care and energy in, then I think it's all of the connections, right? And all of those community pieces to say, okay, if we need shelter for the warming center so that folks don't have to be sleeping in a church basement, just as an example, just as an example, no undertones or, but just, right, if we've decided that a community needs a physical space, a physical shelter, so that, the church buildings don't work, or that's not as safe for the folks who need to be part of that shelter, all of those things, then we start to look at, what can the community do? Right? Are there businesses who are willing to donate their space for something like that? Is there some sort of a grant or some sort of, whether it be state or, whatever, something like that, we can get people behind, and whether it's, the staff or volunteers from a particular organization, or whether it's, a lawyer in the community who says, hey, I know a ton about grant writing, and, that person knows, somebody from Bellfire. And so then, right, but it's sort of that crowdsourcing, right? Because I think so many of us know so many different people for different reasons in the community. And so being able to sort of put all of those pieces in place and not necessarily having it only fall to a staff or to sort of the core volunteers, but being able to say to the community, these are the things that are important. This is why it's important. This is why, and sort of, it sounds bad, right? But I think a lot of large scale change like this, it's a lot of marketing, right? And it's a lot of convincing folks why something is important. And then also, right, probably like a tiny bit of buttering up on some level and saying, you really, really know about grant writing. There is this great program. We found the grants. You know how to do it, right? Because I think we're all human, right? So we all appreciate being acknowledged for the things that we're good at or that we're passionate about and bringing those things together. And then I think the hope is, right, as you get all of those sort of pieces and you get that positive energy and that hope to start going through, I think that's kind of, I need a better word than infectious.
It's not bad.
But it's like there's going to be a different, but right, I think we talked a lot about matching energy that one night. I think there's something to be said for when there's positive movement and energy around something, it's easier to get more positive energy on top of that and sort of run with that momentum. So I think, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as far as that, actually, that's one of the important things about faith communities, because we come together and we learn about these needs and learn from one another, and there's a synergism when you have a base of people working on different goals, but the key is that trying to do good. We're in this life together. That's what I always remind myself of. We're in this life together, and we have to learn to
I love that.
help out.
Right? And I think it's hard. We've talked about too, right? I think so many people are so busy with all of their, work and life and kiddos and parents and, right, just all of those pieces. And so to try and convince them, right, to spend their time or that extra energy on something that's for the greater good. I mean, that's the principle we're relying on, right, is this understanding that we're all connected and that it matters how we behave or speak or live as individuals because it connects us to everyone else and that global, the global community and physical planet of creation and all of those pieces. And I think it shouldn't be as hard to convince folks of as I think it is sometimes.
I think the asking is important. We didn't know that Great Lakes Recovery needed heavier quilts and blankets. And because we had the intern, and she was going around to the different places, and she was their, I can't even think of anyway, she was kind of their spiritual advisor who was there. And one of the people said, yeah, she was the chaplain there. Oh, but I'm cold all the time. And she came here. Well, the quilters, what?
Right.
We have given them quilts in the past, but it kind of had fallen away. We'd forgotten about taking them. So 14 quilts.
Yeah.
It was a matter of the ask. Oh, that.
Well, it was a matter of the listening.
Yeah.
No.
Right.
But,
Right.
I mean, that's the big part is listening. When we talk about going into the communities, listening to them rather than being the one to speak necessarily is sometimes the big secret.
It's true though, right? Yep. And right, that listening and then trusting that you've created a safe enough space for them to be honest, right, about what they need or what that is. But then, also listening and trusting that what they're telling them is important, all those pieces. Yeah. Any other lingering questions or thoughts on our giant God and violence and sin and power and the complexities of our human world? All of those things that we tried to sum up in 4 hours? Because of course that was very doable, right?
So with all of the stress going on, how does a person center themselves for peace within themselves? I mean, what have you heard that's helpful? Meditation, prayer?
I mean, I think it's very much depends on the person, right? I would say yes, definitely a lot of meditation, prayer. A lot of my folks would also say, you know, yoga or other exercise practices to sort of focus. Ironically, I have a friend who's a really, she's a like ultra marathon runner, like all, you know, and for her, one of the ways that she's able to sort of disconnect from her focus on herself as an individual is by running, and is able to kind of use it as a meditative practice, I think. And that helps her, she finds, to sort of think about those larger concepts and how she can connect with the community. So I think too, right, finding, so whether it's meditation or prayer or yoga or attending worship, whatever that space or that growth looks like for you, I think it's also, right, as we all try and find that balance between centering ourselves as individuals in ways that then allow us to reconnect with the larger community. So I think that's sort of the piece that becomes difficult in a lot of ways.
Punish yourself so you can move forward.
Right, yeah. And that openness to being able to move forward or to be able to connect to the community and all of those pieces. Right. And I know we've talked, you know, some too about how or why younger folks maybe aren't as involved in Christian communities, and that maybe a lot of it is to do with sort of stereotypes of the ways that they understand things. And I know I use my Northern students as examples a lot, but I think they would maybe not use this language, but a lot of it for them is they need to understand and see sort of the payoff of what Christian communities are doing in the world. Why does this matter? And I don't think it's that their own faith or spirituality isn't important to them, but it's almost like that's different than what they understand as the purpose of the church gathered. So it's sort of like there's this individualized religiosity or spirituality and relationship with God, and then also the Christian community that is supposed to be doing something. And so it's sort of this, for them, I see this disconnect between, I feel like churches for them are not where they go to find God. It's where they're trying to connect with people who are trying to live out God's work. And it's an interesting sort of split or shift that I don't see. And not that I'm 15 years older than my students probably, so I'm not, totally removed, but even my sort of seminary group of folks, like that is not the way that we understood sort of that break generally, and lots of generalizations. But I just think it's interesting. I think it definitely is a time, I think, when Christian communities have a lot of space and grace to be able to see what they can do in the world, and to ask communities what they need and where the church can fill those needs. And I think that's going to be attractive to a lot of the up and coming young professionals, because they seem really interested. I taught an online course for Elmhurst University in Elmhurst, Illinois, and one of their requirements it's a Christian ethics course, and they had to do a service project as part of that course and write me a paper, and there were only like certain approved, so there were a lot of food pantries, couple of like nursing care facilities. I want to say they did some like flower, this was pre-COVID. I want to say they did some like flower deliveries in hospitals, and were expected to like have conversations. But the large majority of them did, it's called the night ministry, and you go and pack lunches and then go out into the community and give homeless folks these packed lunches and have a conversation with them. And wow, to watch 18, 19, 20-year-olds have this experience, and a lot of them, they're going to school in Elmhurst, Illinois, but a lot of them are from rural Illinois and haven't spent a whole lot of time in downtown anywhere, let alone downtown Chicago. And that, so I mean, I think that organization is really amazing and how they sort of guide students who maybe don't have that skill set yet. But to watch for them, how much, this like one evening of their week that they went and did this project impacted all of these people, and they had in just that short time built some level of relationship with all of these people and had these conversations. And so then all semester, right, you're having discussions about theology, and every single class period they're saying, well, this person that I met when I did this event, right? And it opens them up so much to that relationship and those pieces, but also, right, it reminds them that just because someone is homeless does not make them any less human than you are as a student in a dorm and living in this place, and being able to see them make those connections, right, and like link that. And I think, honestly, right, if more of us as adults got to be able to have those interactions and had the time or the effort or, whatever it is to allow ourselves to build those relationships and see how we connect in that bigger picture more often, maybe it's naive, but I would think that would hopefully make the world a little bit of a better place to have those connections and that reliance.
I'm thinking in terms of if you meet someone who's dressed up in formal wear, and regardless of where they came from, you immediately put them on a certain level. So here they are in their tuxedo, or you in your long dress. And when you meet them out on the street and they're homeless, there's a totally different kind of thing. And oftentimes judgment and such goes along with that kind of thing. And so
absolutely, right? I mean, that's what I used to work at the women's shelter, and so pack rats, but then also the Harbor House itself, right? We always had the professional clothing for women who had an interview and didn't, right? Because I mean, it's impossible to show up as professional if all you have is, like the sweatpants and pajama top that you came into shelter with, right? I mean, yeah, and right or wrong, right? There's all of these physical expectations that we have. If someone is applying for a job, they should be in, a button-down shirt or a blazer or dress pants or, whatever that looks like. And if you don't have access to those things, even I was talking with one of the students, because I think another student, she had a conversation where somebody had made a comment about how come people who don't have jobs have cell phones. And her argument was, how on earth would you get a job if you didn't have a cell phone?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, right? So, and especially now, if you don't have, a public library where you have access to a computer and internet to be able to even apply for jobs, it's just different. And the way that our society has changed, I think our perceptions of what it looks like to be poor or what it looks like to be homeless have kind of stayed the same. And we need to, we got to do better. We have to do better. And that's, it's all of those little pieces and trying to figure out how do we do that.
Isn't there a government program for homeless to have phones?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and, they can go places where they get into the Wi-Fi and they can actually call without having any minutes.
Yeah.
That's the real plus of having not only phones without any minutes.
Right. And like safety too, right? Like good to be able to have that access on all those pieces. Any other, we're being serenaded. I was hearing drums. Any other thoughts about sort of this class or this topic or anything we've covered or want to dig into a little bit more? Would love to pick your brains a little bit and just see what other topics you would be interested in, what other kinds of classes or conversations or styles of things would be of interest, just as we, again, try to live into all of these opportunities we have and make sure that they're helpful. No pressure too. You can also, catch me at church or send me an email. You don't. There is no grade or special attendance points for contributing an idea now.
But I always think about children, and I think there's a lot of ways we could go with that. It could be, providing, mothers and families and things like that. Or, education or food or, I think there's a lot of, if you drew a circle, you could have a lot of,
connection.
I was thinking of how we get to step beyond our fear. We might see a reason to do something and yet not be able to step beyond ourselves and our fear of what might happen, what harm we might have, so that it limits what we might do. So stepping beyond fear. Yeah. It's hard to believe that one time I felt like water. It's right. Okay,
That's true. And consistently, right? Anytime we're outside of our comfort zone like that, right? It takes that extra emotional effort and that extra.
Yes, it does.
And I think, right, not being afraid to say the wrong thing or ask the wrong question, but then being able to, if you are wrong or right, then being able to have that conversation and learn. Yeah, I love that. Any other thoughts or ideas or questions or anything at all?
The fit of minority groups within, this is a fairly homogeneous church. We do have but
Yeah.
what do we do? I know the learning of the Native American kinds of things and the different things that way has been good, but only some of us did, but that's true. How much of a nucleus of action? Are there some statistics that say if you have 5 people together, then it'll work, or it only takes 2, or does one really loud person do it?
Come back to our mob mentality. How loud and how many of us do we have to do this to get it to take off?
Get our ideas.
That's the other piece, right? How do we use our presets as humans to in the best way? If we know we're gonna sort of fall into this mob mentality anyway, and how do we use that for positive gains instead of negative? Yeah, that could be a fun class, like relearning mob mentality.
Positive and negative.
Right? I think they had a flash mob at Black Rocks a few weeks ago or last week, right? So how do we use these these gatherings in positive ways?
On St. Patrick's Day, a fiddler flash mob someplace at one of the.
Yeah, I think that was
at Black Rocks.
At the bar. At the tavern.
In the bar, They did. And he said, "Oh, hey, we're booked for next year already."
Because there's like a lot of fiddles and a lot.
Well, that would be sweet.
Right?
Good music.
It sounded fun. I only saw a little thing on social media. I was not there.
I recognize no the people probably.
Yeah, exactly.
Who's your accordion lady?
Yeah.
So that would be fun.
I also read an article too about young people, and I'm spiritual, but I'm not a church member. I don't feel a need to be a church member, and I think we could have some good conversations about that. And well, I'll just leave it at that for right now.
I think that.
I look at that, how do we make the church relevant to their spirituality that they are seeking? And I think that
Right, and I think, right, that would be some really good conversation, I think, too, because what's sort of that line with, we have the tradition we are, and we have the ways that we do things, and how do we sort of have that be a bridge to, meeting them where they are.
and is that one of the things that outdoor, what is it, Wild UP is aiming at?
That's right, I forgot about that.
The church services that are basically Lutheran happening all over the UP at different.
Usually like outdoor kind of, right?
Wild UP, isn't it? Yeah.
That sounds right.
But isn't that part of the Episcopal Church too?
Could be.
I feel it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a positive thing, to be doing more with the other congregations in town. That's important now, because I guess number one, numbers are going down. and we are in this life together, and we gotta be working together. And I think it's great to be working with the Episcopal Church and Presbyterian and these other groups. And we came together for room at the inn and that sort of thing. And those relationships carry forward, that we can work on other things too. And it is happening to some extent. And maybe now post-COVID, or not post-COVID, but a life of COVID, that we perhaps can do more with the other congregations.
Exactly, it's true. I mean, even I own a trip with the Lutheran and Methodist campus ministries and all the right to be admitted. And Episcopal too, and Methodist, because Erica, I know, is church, so all of those ways that we're able to connect.
And the connecting, I've heard more often than not sometimes. Certain people like to go to church, they like to feel like they're uplift to them and not pummel into the ground. You know what I mean? And I think the community.
Exactly, right? That's sort of especially the pressure on the pastor, right? To have a sermon that is both teaching us something and also helping us get through our week, right? So that's, and right, we do with music and readings and prayers and all those things too. But yeah, how do we make our communities places that are safe, that are welcoming, and that,
understandable for some.
Yeah, yep. Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. Even just I think, and I say this as someone who was raised ELCA Lutheran and had a mom who worked for the church, and so was there and used to it, and we know when to sit and we know when to stand, and even if maybe we don't know if it's tiny communion cups or intinction, we have a general idea of how this is going to work, especially based on how your sanctuary looks. If it's like set up here where you're going to either go down the middle or the sides and you're going to go back the other way, right? So there's sort of all of these things that we know and that we understand. And part of that, right, is really intimately linked to our Christian traditions, right? Because we use that same order of worship that the early Roman Catholic Church did, and most of our mainline Protestants are going to follow that same sort of set. And if you are used to going to church here and you go out to Prince of Peace, you're going to recognize the songs, you're going to recognize, right, the order and all of those things. Also, for the most part, right, if you go to the Presbyterian or Methodist church, same thing, you're going to recognize a lot of those same systems and probably standing at similar times at all of those places. But if you don't have that background, or maybe you had a different, background that would be something more, praise and worship evangelical feeling that doesn't necessarily follow that same sort of flow, it can be really intimidating, right? To come into our traditional spaces where we suddenly all just know to stand, and we give a cues, right? We have in the bulletin how this works, or we have leaders who are, trying to help that. But, right, there's still sort of this insider-outsider language.
But the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Exactly.
Right.
Which isn't something that an awful lot of people who are there, they're going to put.
Right.
Even if it's written, if you're not following or how the whole thing goes. That they said, do you want to get a whole bunch of Lutherans quiet at the same time? Because you want their attention, you stand up in front and say, the Lord be with you. And they'll respond because they're used to it. And also with you, and then there's a little bit of silence. You can start the program.
I'm gonna have to try that now.
I heard it works. I've never tried it.
I'm like thinking back on a lot of choir rehearsals that were real hard to get control of, and I'm like, why didn't I think of that? Huh.
There you go.
That would have been good. I'm like, all right. I'm gonna tuck that away. I'll use that.
Yeah, and you can let me know sometime in the future
Yeah,
whether it
I will
works.
let you know if that works, because now I'm like, who do I get to test this out on?
I don't think it'll work in your classroom.
That's what I was gonna say. I was like, I might try it with them just to see what happens. Just a little social experiment. Just see what happens. Maybe. I was gonna say, I was like, do we meet on May the 4th? Because then I could just, but
You'll be out of semester.
right, it's true. The final is May 2nd, so we're close. Any other thoughts or ideas that truly as you think of them in the I think we're looking at fall for the sort of next round, so you have lots of time to think through it.
But thanks with your teaching assignment for putting this together for us. It's been interesting.
Thank you all for joining and being part of it and being willing to have conversations with me and not just make me do all the work, right? And can actually talk about some things. Awesome. Well, I hope you all have a lovely rest of your evening. Maybe you'll come check out the fundraiser on Friday for the Iona trip.
They have rooms in the bell choir tables.
That's fun. It sounds like it's going to be quite a lineup. I'm excited about it. Sounds like it'll be a good evening. So thank you all so much, and have a lovely rest of your Wednesday. I almost said Tuesday. It's Wednesday.
They haven't asked